Hey guys, today I want to show you how to make a quick working dialog box using Unity and UI Toolkit. This is a lightweight, flexible setup that's great for narrative moments or quick NPC interaction. First, we'll start with an overview of what we're building and walk through the flow of the diagram so you know exactly how everything connects before we jump into Unity. First, let's start with Fuzzy, our player, and Nick, our NPC. Then, we need our trigger. The trigger is needed to start a conversation. This can be pressing a button when you're within range or walking into a new area you just walked into. Now, our trigger needs to do a few things. This needs to get our content data, then feed this data to our UI, then enable our UI. Then we need to toggle request. We start by getting our content data from the NPC content. We can see this by making a request to NPC content and getting a response from NPC content. This will be our dialog data. Now that we received our data, we then need to pass this our VE dialog controller. This controller manages dialog data, deciding what shows up, when it shows up, and when to start or stop the whole thing. Then comes our VE dialog reader. If the controller manages the flow, the reader reads the data and passes it back to the UI to display. This creates a nice clean separation of controller, logic and flow, and reader, data and display. To move the dialog forward, the player then needs to interact by pressing a button or a key that tells the system, hey, I'm done reading this one, let's see the next line. And from there, the system cycles between the controller and the reader, pulling the content, passing it back to the UI, and waiting for the player to proceed. Now that you've seen the concept, let's jump into Unity and start building it together. Now, in order for us to continue, we should head off to the asset store first and check out this asset called Starter Asset Character Controller. This is a free asset provided by Unity, and this will act as our character controller for this tutorial. Alright, let's kick things off by setting up a quick little test scene. I went to game object, 3D object, terrain, dropped one in and resized it to 25 by 25. Just enough space to run around without getting lost or bored. This will be our makeshift playground while we build things out in the tutorial. Once you've imported the character controller, navigate to the starter assets, runtime, third person controller, prefabs, player capsule, and drag the third-person controller prefab into your scene. Next, assign your camera as a child of the capsule and reposition it to get a good view angle of your character. We'll be tweaking this setup a bit as we go, but this will give us a solid starting point. Next up, let's add a good old-fashioned cube to the scene. This is going to act as our trigger. When the player runs into it, we'll use it to kick off the dialogue. Think of it as our placeholder talk to me box. Now, let's add a bit of color to our scene. Create a new materials folder in your project panel, then right-click it and create a new material. Set its base map color to red, something that's easy to spot while we're testing, and assign it to the cube we added earlier. Just a small touch to help it stand out during gameplay testing. Now, let's set up the rest of the folders we'll be using throughout the tutorial series. In the project window, create 3 new folders. Art assets for any artwork or background images, UI documents where we'll store all of our UI Toolkit files, and scripts for, you guessed it, our code. Once that's set up, go to the top menu and open the UI Toolkit Editor. You'll find this under Window, UI Toolkit, UI Builder. As soon as it opens, hit save and create a new file called dialogbox.uxml. You can save this under the UI documents. This will be our main UI layout for the dialog system. Then, in the top left panel, click the plus icon and choose Create New USS. Name it dialogbox.uss. This will be our custom style sheet for the dialog box styling later on. Now, for a bit of visual flair, I'm going to import a background art asset from another project to use as a backdrop for our dialog box. If you're doing the same, don't forget to set the texture type to sprite so it works with UI Toolkit. Now, I had to re-record this part, but otherwise it should still be about the same. If you notice, I have a player UI and a UI object. The player UI is a separate scene, and the UI object is needed for the UI document. In the UI document, you'll have the panel settings, and you can select the touchscreen input panel settings. That's the default provided by the character controller. That should still work the same way. Next, you should be able to open UI Toolkit via the UI editor. And once that opens up, you can assign 2 visual elements, the main content and the dialog box. The main content is just an empty placeholder that we're using in order to bump down the dialog box. Set the main content height to 70% and the dialog box's height to 30%. That way they're assorted correctly. Next, inside of the background, you should be able to, if you have a background sprite asset, you should be able to assign it into the dialog box, and that should give it a background that you should be able to visually see inside the scene. Now, if you don't immediately see the UI object, Sometimes UI Toolkit isn't rendering the object immediately, so you can play around by just resizing the dialog box a little bit and it should pop up immediately. If it doesn't, you can also play around with the sort order inside the UI document, and that should make it appear in the scene as well. If all else fails, you can also change the height percent of both the main content and dialog box to pixel size instead of percent. Percent's usually more reliable though, but if you need to, you can reset that and that should fix it. Now let's continue building out the hierarchy. Under dialog box, we're going to add a new child element called dialog content. This will act as a container for everything inside the dialog: text, portraits, buttons, whatever we want later. And inside the dialog content, we'll add another child element called dialog text. This will be the actual label that displays the dialog message to the player. Now if you take a look at the image on the screen, these are the styling settings I use for the dialog box element. For the dialog, I've set the height to 200 pixels and the width to 50%. This gives the dialog a clean center footprint on the screen. I've also aligned the content to the center both horizontally and vertically, so everything inside stays neatly positioned. Inside that, the dialog content has a width of 80% and a height of 60%. Since my dialog box sits at a slight angle or position offset, this helps center the text visually and keeps everything aligned nicely within the box. Finally, I updated the main content element to have a fixed height of 600 pixels just to balance out the layout and give us some room for gameplay visuals above the dialogue. Now, if you copied the previous scene, all you have to do afterwards is open the USS styles with your UXML file inside the UI editor and assign each USS style to the correct visual element. Otherwise, if you use the UI editor, you'll notice here that I have the US style, no content in it, which means that the UXML file has all the style sheets. So what you can do is open the visual element, go to the style class list on the right, type in the name to align with it. So in this case, I am using dialog box, and hit the button that says extract inline styles to new class. Then hit save. After you hit save, you'll notice on the top left pane, the dialog box USS now has the new USS element added to it. And then we just rinse and repeat for every single visual element. And if you're curious, you can open the dialog box UXML file and you'll notice that there is no longer a style reference, but instead there's a class reference, which references the USS style that was just added. Now I'm going back to my cube and I'm going to add a child game object to it and call it collider. Then I'm going to add a component called box collider and increase the size to 555. That way we have a radius that we can hit and the capsule enters it. Finally, I'm going to enable the isTrigger Boolean option to it. Now, on screen, you'll see the NPC trigger script. Now, let's break down what's happening here. At the top, we declare our NPC content class and grab a reference to our VE dialog controller. Both of these are initialized in the start function, so they're ready as soon as the scene begins. Next, we have the onTrigger method. This gets automatically called when the player collides with the box collider that we just set up earlier. Inside this trigger, we perform 3 key steps. Fetch the content data from the NPC content, feed that data into the dialog controller, and finally enable the UI. The good news is step 3 is handled directly inside the dialog controller itself. That's its job, managing the dialog flow and handling when the UI shows up. Next, let's take a look at the NPC content class. This one's pretty straightforward. It just holds a simple list of strings for now, which represents the dialog lines. But this setup is flexible. In the future, you could easily swap this out to fetch content from a database, ScriptableObjects, or even return a full model object that includes things like the speaker's name, portrait, or events. For this tutorial though, we're keeping it simple, just the raw lines of dialogue. Now, we're moving on to the VE dialog controller, which handles the dialog data flow. Its job is to decide what shows up, when it shows up, and when to start or stop the entire dialog process. At the top of the script, we initialize reference to the visual element we created earlier, specifically dialog content and dialog text box. These are direct references to the element in our UI. We also grab a reference to root, which is the top level element available in every UI toolkit setup. It's your entry point to the visual tree. Inside the start method, we use root query to search for and assign our UI references. Next, we have input dialog, which acts as the entry point for incoming dialog data. Once we receive that data, we fetch the next piece of content from our dialog reader, assign it to our dialog text box label, and finally, enable the dialog UI. Now that the dialog is on screen, what about progressing through it? We want the player to be able to click anywhere on the dialog box to advance to the next line. That's where our dialog mouse down method comes in. First, we register a click event to dialog content. That means every time the player clicks the dialog box, on dialog mouse down gets called. Inside that method, we do a couple things. We check if we reach the end of our dialog. If so, we hide the dialog box. Otherwise, we fetch the next line of text from our reader and update the label with the new content. And that's it. Clean, simple, and totally extensible if you want to build on it later. Finally, let's take a look at the dialog reader. This class has a pretty straightforward job. It simply reads the next piece of dialog content from the list. Each time it's called, it checks if we've reached the end of the content. If there's nothing left to read, or we've hit the maximum count, it returns an empty string, signaling that the dialog is finished. Otherwise, it keeps track of how many lines we've already shown and returns the next available line in the list. This setup works great for linear dialogue, but you could easily expand this to support branching conversations, character-specific dialogue, or even event triggers tied to certain lines. Back in Unity, we need to wire up our components to the right game objects. First, assign the VE dialog controller script to your UI object, the one that holds your UI document. Then head back to the cube we created earlier, click on its collider, and attach both the NPC content and NPC trigger scripts. This sets up the full connection so we can trigger our dialogue when the player walks up to the cube. Now, go ahead and hit play in Unity, and you'll probably notice there's no mouse cursor. That's because of the character controller we imported from the Unity starter assets. By default, it locks and hides the cursor. To fix this, open the starter assets input script and comment out line 71, the one that calls set cursor state. That line is what's preventing the mouse from appearing. Once you've done that, hit save and go back to Unity and press play again. You should now be able to move your character around using the WASD keys, walk up to the cube, and click to start progressing through the dialog lines you assigned. Nice and simple. We're almost there. Now, let's add a bit of visual polish to our dialog box by creating a simple hover effect. To do this, open up your dialog box USS style sheet and add an empty selector for dialog box hover. You don't need to add any styles to it just yet, just save the file. Once you've done that, head back into the UI Toolkit editor and click the dialog box element. You'll now see a new hover state available in the styling panel. Thanks to that empty rule we just added, click the hover state, then scroll down to the transform section. Set the scale X and Y values to 1.1. This will make the dialog box subtly grow when the mouse hovers over it, just enough to add some interactivity. Next, switch back to the normal dialog box styling and set the transform duration under animation to 0.3 seconds. That'll give the hover effect a smooth animation instead of snapping instantly. Now, go ahead and hit play. You'll see that little bits of visual polish when you hover over the dialog box, making the UI feel more interactive, more responsive, and just that much more satisfying. And that wraps up our basic dialog system using UI Toolkit. But honestly, there's so much more we can build on top of this. We could create a full content database using Unity ScriptableObjects, or even better, hook it up with one of my favorite tools, BGDatabase, for easy content management. Or we could add an event system that triggers gameplay changes, like spawning a boss mid-dialogue. Yeah, it gets real fun real fast. If you enjoyed this tutorial and want to see those kinds of advanced features, hit that like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming up next.